Well, good morning, everyone. We are going to start in the interest of time, but of course, we're going to have some participants joining during this session. My name is Veronica Wacho. I'm joined here by my colleague Sharon Hagen from the Standard Division in GRI. Sharon worked on the development of GRI 303, Water and Effluents, 2018, and I worked on GRI 403, Occupational Health and Safety. Besides us, also today is Andy Binland, manager at Redefining Value in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He will be presenting us also a little introduction about the World Business Council. So welcome, everyone. Before we start, I would like to share with you some instructions on how to use WebEx. Probably most of you already know this. We have muted you to avoid any background noise during the webinar, but if you have any issues with audio, you can select audio from the top bar menu to test your system, or you can contact us via the chat or by email at standards@globalreporting.org. If you have any questions or comments on any of the contents that we will be presenting, please type them in the chat on the bottom right hand on the WebEx, and we will address them at the end during the Q&A session. Let me see. Let's start with the agenda for today. First, Andy will present to you a short introduction about the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, as I told you. Then Sharon will give you a quick overview of the standard review process, and she will take a deep dive into the key features of the new GRI 303 Water and Effluents Reporting Standard. After that, I will present to you the new standard, the GRI 403 Occupational Health and Safety Standard, and then we will open the Q&A session to respond to any questions that you have submitted via the chat or that you want to raise during the Q&A. So let's move on to Sharon. To Andy.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, and thank you to Veronica and Sharon for your input as well. So firstly, perhaps just a little bit of background on WBCSD and why we're actually running this webinar in partnership with the Global Reporting Initiative today. Very high level about what we do at WBCSD. I suspect that many of you already know this, but we operate through six programs, and we look at the major economic systems, so around cities and mobility, energy and climate, food, land and water, people, circular economy, and the area that my work focuses on is around the redefining value area in the centre there. So this is a very confusing slide that basically shows the depth and breadth of all the work that is happening at WBCSD. So under each program, we have a number of different projects, sort of delving deeper into around circular economy hub, human rights, future of work, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see the redefining value area, which is the area that's most relevant to this webinar today. We actually have a whole program area on external disclosure, and that's the rationale for this webinar this morning. So, in context, fundamentally, what we see at WBCSD is that there's a disconnect between the financial system and the non-financial system. So the financial system allocates capital. It doesn't always do that fairly equally, and it certainly doesn't take into account other capitals. On the other hand, the non-financial system recognizes the goals of sustainability, but there's not that integration between the two systems. So our ambition is to basically reduce that disconnect or eliminate that disconnect between the financial and the non-financial system. So essentially, the way we are trying to do this is by supporting our members to make better decisions around environmental, social, and governance topics, and how they then subsequently disclose that more meaningful information through their reporting cycle. In turn, we see that the financial system can then use that information to make decisions and direct flows of capital to more sustainable companies. So the most sustainable companies also in turn become more successful. So how do we do this? Well, we are mainly trying to build on existing business processes where we recognize that the sustainability may not be as well integrated into those as that could be. So for instance, around risk management, we've been working with COSO and recently published a guidance on how to integrate environmental, social and governance issues into the enterprise risk management framework. So we've developed tools, guidance, case studies, and also provide educational opportunities through our leadership program to improve the decision usefulness of information to the financial system. So there's one thing I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of in terms of our external disclosure work. So firstly is the reporting exchange. That's a global resource that covers 65 different countries in terms of the reporting requirements, supporting resources that are currently available. The relevance to this webinar is that obviously we're going to talk about the new GRI standards. That information about the standards is obviously available and linked through to the GRI website, but there's also information on there about how to methodologies available for water use, other tools and resources available for business. So definitely worth checking out. And I wanted to also say a few words about a piece of research that we've done this year called Reporting Matters. Move on to the next slide. So essentially the purpose of this research that we've developed in partnership with Radley Elder is to improve the effectiveness of non-financial reporting amongst our membership. We provide an overview of reporting trends within the membership. We offer feedback sessions to our members on how to implement more effective reporting. And in the report that was published in October this year, you'll see examples of good practice and practical examples of how our members are looking to improve their reporting, their external disclosure on a range of topics. So we do this assessment basically covering 18 different criteria, which to get a kind of fairly holistic view of sustainability reporting. And those of you who are already familiar with GRI will recognize some of the principles that we set out in the top row of indicators are already aligned with some of the principles of the GRI program, or the GRI standard, sorry. We also look at the reporting content and how well that aligns with the issues and topics that companies deem to be material through the materiality process, and how well how coherent the report is in that sense. And then finally, we look at the reporting experience. So how easy is it to navigate? How easy is it to find information? Is a clear story and messaging that sets out the corporate strategy related to sustainability issues? And for the first time this year, we also looked at how companies are doing in terms of their SDG disclosures. So what did we find? Well, firstly, since we started this research in 2013, the vast majority of our members have improved their overall score. I think most significantly that disclosures around materiality and the materiality process have also improved. So 37% of companies have improved in that over that time, which I think is a very positive thing. In terms of SDG reporting, again, the vast majority of the reports that we reviewed acknowledged the SDGs in some way. However, there's still a lot of work to do in terms of how companies are mapping their strategy to the relevant SDGs and providing evidence of activities. In terms of integrated reporting, we're seeing uptake in terms of the number of our members who are linking or combining financial and non-financial information in their reports, and around 18 of those are self-declared integrated reports, many of which are integrated reports but also reference the GRI standards as well. In terms of GRI reporting, Again, the vast majority of our members are all referencing GRI in the report, again, so the rationale for this webinar. And again, over half have already transitioned to the GRI standard, which since it was launched in October 2016. We also see that governance around ESG topics is strengthening. Companies are doing generally slightly better overall on our governance criteria, and we did a bit of additional work looking at data from our Bloomberg terminal to see how many of our members had this link between sustainability performance and executive remuneration. And it's about just under 40% of those. And finally, we're seeing very much a transition in terms of reports from PDF to digital. I think over half our members now have the bulk of their reporting content online to complement any PDF. So we think that's a trend that's going to continue, and we'd like to see more and more disclosures transition into an online space as well as a PDF report. So that was just a very quick overview of some of our work around external disclosure at WBCSD. If you'd like to know more about the Reporting Matters research, you can find the publication on our website, wbcsd.org. And with that, I'm going to hand over back to Sharon and Veronica for them to give us a bit of a deep dive into the two updates to the GRI standards. Thank you both.
Thank you very much, Andy. Yes, now it's time for Sharon to present you a bit about GRI 303.
Hi everyone, my name is Sharon Hagen, and I will talk about the review of the two standards briefly, and then I'll take a deep dive into the water and effluent standard. And just a note that if you have any questions in the meantime, you can send them through the chat, and then we can discuss them at the end of the session. So the GRI standards, they have a modular structure, which makes it possible for individual standards to be updated independently to stay up to date with the latest developments. GRI 303 Water and GRI 403 Occupational Health and Safety, they were the first GRI standards that have been reviewed. Both of these standards have been revised to align with international best practice and recent developments in water stewardship and occupational health and safety management and reporting, and to harmonize with key instruments and reporting frameworks. GRI 303 was harmonized with key reporting frameworks such as the CDP Water Questionnaire and the CEO Water Mandate Corporate Reporting Guidelines, and GRI 403 is aligned with key instruments developed by the International Labour Organization and with the ISO 45001 standard. Additionally, the global priorities that are identified in the Sustainable Development Goals have also been a key point of reference for both of these standards. The process of developing or updating GRI standards, such as GRI 303 Water and 403 Occupational Health and Safety, is overseen by the Global Sustainability Standards Board, the GSSB, and that's GRI's independent standard setting body, and it follows the due process protocol. All standards are developed through a transparent and inclusive process and in the public interest. The content of both these standards was developed by a multi-stakeholder project working group, including leading experts and practitioners on water stewardship and occupational health and safety. And they come from the constituencies of civil society, investors, business, labor, and international and governmental institutions from around the world. A draft of both standards was released for public comment, and we have received nearly 1,400 comments from stakeholders, nearly 800 on the exposure draft of water, and 600 on the exposure draft of occupational health and safety. If you're interested to know anything else about the review process, you can visit the project pages on the GRI website. So let's have a look at the revised water and effluent standard now. So first, I want to go through the key changes in the revised standard. And overall, the revised standard introduces a holistic framework for collecting information about an organization's water use, the associated impacts, and how it addressed them. It allows organizations and their stakeholders to understand the impacts on precious freshwater resources, particularly in areas where the ability to meet the human and ecological demand for water is already under stress. The amount of water withdrawn and consumed by an organization and the quality of its discharges can impact the functioning of ecosystems. As a consequence, these impacts can have wider social and economic consequences for local communities. As such, the management approach section within the standard has been significantly expanded to capture how organizations manage water as a shared resource and how they manage impacts at a local level. Content on discharge from the GRI 306 Effluents and Waste Standard has been incorporated into the revised GRI 303 standard, and we have done that to help provide the full picture of water impacts from withdrawal to discharge and consumption. It means that more detail is now required on reporting water discharge information, including the quality of water discharges, substances of concern that is present in effluent, and the approach to setting the minimum standards for the quality of effluent discharges. There's also a new disclosure on water consumption. From an impact perspective, it helps to measure water that has not returned back to the environment. There's also an emphasis now in areas with water stress when reporting water withdrawal, discharge, and consumption, and that's due to the local nature of water issues. It gives information on how areas with water stress are affected and where action to address these impacts is needed most. There's also a distinction to freshwater and other water introduced in the standard for reporting water withdrawal and water discharge. It allows to capture the impact that an organization has on critical freshwater resources, and it also promotes positive practices to manage water of lower quality. The standard has also introduced a requirement to report impacts in the value chain. A new reporting requirement asks organizations how they interact with water and the impacts across the value chain. Reporting recommendations have also been added to report quantitative information about water use in the supply chain. This information may not always be possible, but the disclosure encourages organizations to set up management systems. There are also new recommendations to report facility-level information for water withdrawal and water consumption. It's the kind of information that will be demanded more and more in the future, as measuring impacts at a local level will become much more relevant. And finally, more extensive guidance has been added throughout the standard, including example tables for presenting data, new and updated definitions to align reporters on key concepts and terms, and there is guidance on how to compile the data. So let's have a look at the disclosures themselves. So on the screen you can see an overview of all the disclosures that are included in the new standard. There are two disclosures for an organization to explain its management approach towards water and effluents. They include qualitative information about how an organization interacts with water and manages any associated impacts. Underneath, you can see that there are 3 topic-specific disclosures to report on impacts from water use. They include disclosures on water withdrawal, discharge, and consumption. Due to the strong relationship between water withdrawal, discharge, and consumption, organizations are encouraged to report on all 3 of these topic-specific disclosures. And then each of these disclosures can have additional requirements on how to compile or present the information. It can have recommendations, and it can have guidance. So about the management approach disclosures, the water standard, the water and effluent standard, is designed to be used together with the management approach standard. GRI 103, the management approach standard, includes generic disclosures on how an organization manages each material topic, including water and effluents. It requires information on why the topic is material, the approach to managing the topic, including key components as policies, responsibilities, goals and targets, and an evaluation of the management approach. The revised water and effluent standards and the revised occupational health and safety standard, as you will learn a little bit later on, also include management approach disclosures that are specific to these topics. They're presented as disclosures using a disclosure number and a disclosure title. It's a new feature which is currently only included in these two revised standards. And for this particular standard, we have two management approach disclosures for water and effluents, which are 3031 and 3032, as you can see on the screen. When an organization has identified water and effluents as a material topic, it's required to report its management approach for this topic using both the management approach disclosures in the management approach standard and the two management approach disclosures in the water and effluent standard. Now let's have a look at the disclosures in more detail. The first disclosure, 3031, is a management approach disclosure, and it requests an organization to disclose narrative information about how it interacts with water as a shared resource to understand the importance of water to the organizations overall and the impact it may have, and how the organization mitigates the impact and manages water as a shared resource. Disclosure 3032 is also a management approach disclosure, and it requests an organization to disclose narrative information about how it manages impacts related to water discharge. It requests a description of any minimum standards it has set for the quality of effluent discharge and how these minimum standards are determined. In the context of the GRI standards, minimum standards are those that go beyond regulatory requirements in controlling the quality of effluent discharge. Next, there are three topic-specific disclosures. The first one, 3033, on water withdrawal, requires organizations to disclose quantitative information about their water withdrawal. There is a distinction for reporting information regarding areas with water stress. So organizations are required to report their total water withdrawal for all areas and separately for areas with water stress, broken down by surface water, groundwater, seawater, produced water, and third-party water, where third-party means water that's supplied by municipal water networks or other organizations. If organizations source third-party water from areas with water stress, they're also required to report the original source of this water. So is it coming from the surface or from groundwater, etc. Organizations are further required to report a breakdown of total water withdrawal from each of these sources by freshwater and other water, where freshwater is water with a concentration of total dissolved solids less or equal than 1,000 milligrams per liter, and other water is any water that has a concentration of total dissolved solids above that. The organization is only required to provide this breakdown for the sources that it has withdrawn water from, so for example only surface water and groundwater. We're asking for this information to make it clear if freshwater sources are affected by the organization, while allowing to disclose information about water of a lower quality that an organization may be managing in significant volumes. Finally, organizations are required to report any contextual information that's necessary to understand how the data have been compiled, such as any standards, methodologies, and assumptions used. This improves comparability and credibility of data for stakeholders who are using the report. The disclosure further includes guidance on how to assess areas with water stress and what's the difference between freshwater and other water. Disclosure 3034 requires organizations to disclose quantitative information about their water discharge. Organizations are required to report total water discharge to all areas broken down by destination, which you can see on the screen. And it also asks for this information for areas with water stress. Organizations are further required to report the priority substances of concern for which discharges are treated, including how they define these priority substances of concern, the approach that they use for setting discharge limits for these substances of concern, and the number of incidents of non-compliance with these discharge limits. Same as in the previous disclosure, organizations are required to report any contextual information to improve the comparability and credibility of data. The guidance provides more information on how to identify priority substances of concern, and again, the difference between freshwater and other water. The last topic-specific disclosure is new to this standard, and it requires organizations to report their water consumption to understand the volume of water that's not returned back to the environment. It requires organizations to report water consumption from all areas and separately the total water consumption from areas with water stress. Some organizations may have operations that require to put significant volumes of water in storage, such that it is not available for use by others in the reporting period. In these instances, organizations are required to report the figure for the change in water storage in the reporting period. Finally, organizations are required to report any contextual information necessary to understand how the data have been compiled, same as in the other two previous disclosures. The guidance to this disclosure provides formulas for calculating water consumption and how to calculate the change in water storage. So let's quickly have a look at some of the elements that are built into the standard and that will be helpful for reporters when compiling the data. So first is a table for presenting all the information that's requested in the topic-specific disclosures in a consolidated manner. On your left, you can see the full table, and on the right, it's a zoom in to a view into one of the sections. So you can see it's water withdrawal by source and total water withdrawal. Please note that it's not required to use these tables, and you can amend them based on your own practices. So you can delete fields or you can report additional information. The other element is the glossary, and it includes definitions for key terms used in the standards. It's required to use the definitions in the glossary, and the reason why this is so important is because definitions can define what needs to be measured, and by doing that, it ensures comparability of reported quantitative information. So this was the information about the revised standard. What I also want to tell you briefly is that there is a linkage document available between GRI and the CDP Water Security Questionnaire, and it shows how these two reporting frameworks are aligned, and it's to show how reporters can use either the revised Water and Effluent Standard or CDP's questionnaire as input for responding to either framework. So the document includes instructions for how to use the linkage document. It also explains the differences in key terms as impact and boundary, and then it includes summary tables and comprehensive tables to show the linkages between the two frameworks. And it also includes a definitions linkage table to show how the terms that are defined in both frameworks are aligned. The comments that are included in the table support and then expand on the linkages between the two reporting frameworks to help reporters understand how they can actually use the two frameworks together. So thank you, and I'll now give the floor to Veronica, who will talk to you about the revised GRI 4.3 Occupational Health and Safety Standard.
Thank you very much, Sharon. So let's move on to occupational health and safety. Before moving on, just want to remind you to keep sending us questions via the chat in case you have any question about now occupational health and safety. I want to present to you a quick view of the key features of this new standard before we move on into each of the disclosures. So first, this standard is taking a holistic approach to health and safety at work. It's covering both prevention of harm and promotion of work health. So it places a special emphasis on prevention. For example, there's an emphasis on the identification of hazards and assessment of risks and the application of the hierarchy of controls all throughout the standard. It also includes new specific content on health promotion, including access to healthcare and programs to address health risks related to lifestyle and other programs. Besides this, there's a new section that we included in the standard describing in detail the scope of workers for occupational health and safety. Now the standard covers the following subset of workers. The organization is expected to be responsible for their occupational health and safety and should therefore include this subset into the reporting. They include the following three. First, the workers who are employees, then other workers whose work or workplace is controlled by the organization, and the cases where the organization is directly linked to significant impacts on the health and safety of workers by its business relationships. So workers whose work and or workplace is controlled by the organization can include, for example, volunteers, contractors, self-employed persons, agency workers, and others. However, it is important here to note that the worker type does not determine whether the worker is to be included or not in the report. The criteria for inclusion is the control of work and control of workplace, and this determines that the worker should be considered in the report. Now, there is a greater focus on assessing the impact of work-related injuries and ill health on workers. Traditionally, lost work time has been used as the primary criterion for recording work-related injuries or ill health, or for determining their severity. But given the focus of the GRI standards, which is to understand organizations' impacts on people, in this case workers, and their contribution to sustainable development, it was important to focus first and foremost on how work-related injuries and ill health impact workers. So, for example, in addition to lost time cases of work-related injuries or ill health, the standard is covering other significant work-related injuries or ill health diagnosed by a physician or other licensed healthcare professional, even if these cases did not result in lost time. So, for example, this could be cases of hearing loss or damage to ligaments, which happen due to work-related exposures or incidents, but which did not result in lost time or did not reduce the worker's ability to perform their regular duties. There's also a greater emphasis on health compared to before. The ILO has estimated that work-related diseases represent the main cause of death at work, killing almost six times more workers than occupational accidents. And this is what the standard is reflecting now. So among the changes, you're going to see that data on work-related ill health has been separated from injury data and presented in a separate disclosure. There are new disclosures on occupational health services, access to healthcare, and worker health promotion. And the standard explicitly covers emerging occupational diseases, such as musculoskeletal disorders and mental health disorders. Finally, let me share with you the last key feature is that it includes methodologies, new methodologies for measuring and reporting work-related injuries and ill health, which make this information more consistent and comparable between organizations. So, for example, the standard now requires specific formulas to be used for calculating rates of work-related injury. It also requires absolute data to be provided alongside standardized rates. And the standard includes extensive guidance, definitions, and examples for compiling the data. Now let's move into the contents of the standard. As I mentioned before, and probably here you see it's difficult to see the content. This is just a reproduction of 2 pages of the standard. The first section is the scope of workers to be covered when reporting with GRI 403. This section includes detailed explanations and examples of workers to be included in the report. Now, here you see an overview of the disclosures included in the standard. For this case, we have 7 disclosures for an organization to explain its management approach for occupational health and safety. And then there are 3 topic-specific disclosures to report on key elements of performance and impacts. This includes disclosures on the extent to which workers are covered by an occupational health and safety management system, and then data on work-related injuries and data on work-related ill health. Now, as Sharon explained to you before, this standard also works in the same way with GRI 103. When an organization identifies occupational health and safety as a material topic, it is required to report its management approach for this topic using both GRI 103 management approach and the 7 disclosures on GRI 403. Moving on to 403.1. The first disclosure that we have here requires a statement of whether the organization has implemented an occupational health and safety management system, and then information about legal requirements and recognized standards or guidelines on which the system is based. Additionally, it requires describing the scope of workers, activities, and workplaces that are covered by this system. The next disclosure covers the processes for identifying hazards, assessing risks, and applying the hierarchy of controls, including how the organization ensures the quality of these processes and how the results are used to evaluate and improve the management system. Here we have an important concept in the standard. It's hierarchy of controls. The aim of the hierarchy of controls is to protect workers by ranking the ways in which hazards can be controlled. Each control in the hierarchy is considered less effective than the next one. So, for example, eliminating a hazard is the most effective control measure an organization can apply. But if that is not possible, the second option is to substitute the hazard with a less hazardous process or material, and so on. So this concept was introduced in the standard, and it is based on ILO and ISO definitions. Besides this, in 403.2, it is also required to report on the processes that allow workers to report work-related hazards and to remove themselves from work situations that they believe could cause injury or ill health, as well as the processes related to incident investigation. The next disclosure focuses on the relevant occupational health services implemented by the organization, including how the organization ensures the quality of these services and facilitates workers' access to these services. Now here we would like to note that occupational health services are defined as services that have essentially a preventive function, and they are responsible for advising the employer, the workers, and the representatives on what is required to establish and maintain a safe and healthy work environment. So they include, for example, advice on ergonomics or protective equipment. This is also based on ILO definitions. Disclosure 403.4 is concerned on the description of the processes for worker participation and consultation on the development, implementation, and evaluation of the management system. And also here, organizations report processes for providing access to and communicating relevant information on occupational health and safety to workers. Also, if there are formal joint management worker health and safety committees, the organization is required to report about them and explain whether any workers are not represented by these committees, and then the reasons why. 403.5 focuses on worker training, and this includes generic occupational health and safety training, and also training on specific work-related hazards, hazardous activities, or hazardous situations. Now, Disclosure 4036 covers the promotion of workers' health. This disclosure requires information about workers' access to non-occupational medical and healthcare services, and about any voluntary health promotion services and programs offered to workers to address major non-work-related health risks. And the last management approach disclosure requires a description of the organization's approach to preventing or mitigating significant negative occupational health and safety impacts, which are directly linked to the organization's activities by its business relationships, and also what the related hazards and risks have been identified. So as said before, even if the organization has no control of the work or the workplace, it is still expected to make efforts to prevent and mitigate negative impacts that are directly linked to its activities by its business relationships. And this can include, for example, the use of leverage when negotiating with suppliers. Now let's move on to the topic-specific disclosures. Here we have 3 topic-specific disclosures. 4038 requires the number and percentage of employees and other workers where there is control of the work and the workplace that are covered by the Occupational Health and Safety Management System. This includes data on the use of internal and external audits or certification. Now, some organizations may not have all quantitative data for all workers within the required scope or all the topic-specific disclosures. This is this disclosure and the next 2. So these 3 disclosures include a requirement for the organization to explain whether any workers have been excluded from the disclosure, including the types of worker excluded and the reasons for their exclusion. And also, it is required to report for all the topic-specific disclosures any contextual information needed to understand how the data has been compiled, such as standard methodologies or assumptions used. This would give a context on the numbers provided for the topic-specific disclosures. Let's move on to 4039. This disclosure covers work-related injuries. It requires the following information: the number and rate of fatalities as a result of work-related injury, the number and rate of high-consequence work-related injuries excluding fatalities, the number and rate of recordable work-related injuries, and the main types of work-related injury. Besides this, the number of hours worked. This is required first for employees and then for workers where there is control of the work and the workplace. An important concept here is high-consequence work-related injury. This refers to an injury that results in a fatality or in an injury from which the worker does not, or is not expected to recover fully to pre-injury health status within 6 months. This concept helps shift the focus of reporting from loss of productivity for the organization to evaluating the impact on the worker's health. Now, organizations are also required to report on work-related hazards that pose a risk of high-consequence injury, and the actions taken to eliminate this and other relevant hazards. The standard allows for the use of either the 200,000 hours or the 1 million hours rate for calculating the injury rates. Therefore, the reporting organization is required to state which of the 2 options has been used. And the last topic-specific disclosure covers work-related ill health. It requires the following information: the number of fatalities as a result of work-related ill health, the number of cases of recordable work-related ill health, and the main types of ill health. Similarly to the previous disclosure, this set of data is required on one side for employees, and then required for workers who are not employees but whose work or workplace is controlled by the organization. Also, this disclosure requires the work-related hazards that pose a risk of ill health and how these are eliminated or controlled. Now, in this context, ill health is used to indicate damage to health in general, and it includes diseases, illnesses, and disorders. Finally, the last 2 sections of the standard are a glossary with definitions for key terms used and a list of references that may be helpful for understanding and applying the standard. And as Sharon explained, When preparing a report in accordance with the GRI standards, organizations are required to use the definitions that you can find in the glossary. Now, let's see a few points, again, on how to use both of these standards. Both GRI 303, Water and Effluents, and GRI 403, Occupational Health and Safety, will be effective for reports or other materials published on or after the 1st of January 2021. This means that its use will be required from that date, but early adoption is encouraged. Now, the 2016 versions can continue to be used for reports or other materials if they are published before the 31st of December 2020, but since the new standards represent leading best practice on water stewardship and on occupational health and safety management, existing reporters and new reporters are advised to start using the new standards right away, even if they cannot meet all requirements needed for core or comprehensive. They can explain whatever disclosure cannot be presented in reasons for omission or in the context for each of the disclosures. And finally, a couple of words that I would like to share with you about other projects that we're working on at GRI Standards Division. So as I said, GRI 303 and GRI 403 are two standards that have been reviewed and published, but as Sharon explained, the modular structure of the GRI standards allows us to update individual standards or create new ones in line with latest developments. So here are three that we are right now working on. There's a new standard with disclosures on tax and payments to governments, which has been developed by a technical committee and will be released for public comment soon. So if you have interest in that topic, keep an eye on our website. There's also on GRI 303, Effluents and Waste, a revision is going on right now with the aim to bring disclosure on waste management in line with international best practice. A project working group has been reviewing the standard since last September. And I see we have a question about that standard, so maybe Sharon can explain a bit more. And then finally, there's a technical committee working right now on developing human rights-related disclosures for the GRI standards. The project aims to align the standards with key authoritative intergovernmental instruments, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So just this is a quick overview of the new standards that we have published and what we are working on, but please visit our website to follow progress on these projects and for more information about GRI standard development. So now I open the session for a short Q&A piece that we will have now.
Thank you, Veronica. So yeah, there is one question that has come in on plans to revise the GRI 306 standard, which is called Effluents and Waste. And as Veronica just showed, is that we are currently working on updating the waste-related disclosures from this standard. So when we were reviewing the water standard, we have updated the effluents-related content that is currently in the 306 standard, and we have integrated that within the revised water and effluent standard. As a consequence of this, we have now decided to also work on updating the waste-related content from the GRI 306 effluents and waste standard. So we have a project working group, we have had a few meetings so far, and we are currently developing the content for this standard. We will have an exposure draft coming out hopefully in the first half of next year. And if everything goes to plan, we may have a similar webinar to talk about the waste-related content. So maybe good to mention as well is that if you are reporting on effluents at the moment, and you may wonder how you want to report on it now, Then I can tell you that there are currently 2 options for reporting on effluents. So the first one is that you will report, or that you will use the revised water and effluent standard. And then the other option is that you can still use the effluents and waste standard that we currently have to report on effluents. So both of these options are valid. We do encourage organizations, though, to use the new water and effluent standard because these disclosures on effluents are more up to date. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. We have received a couple of questions on OHS. First of all, if we have some examples of work-related injuries, here in the standard you can find in guidance for 4039 a couple of examples. We have types of work-related injuries which could include, for example, death, amputation of a limb, laceration, fracture, hernia, loss of consciousness, and paralysis, among others. But we also invite you to consult the references for more guidance and more examples to disclose in your report. Additionally, it was asked what list of work-related ill health was used. And in the standard, when the experts were developing this standard, they decided to use the ILO list of occupational diseases as a reference. But your report does not need to be limited to those because we understand that the classification may vary across countries or regions. So in the report, the organizations can explain if any other list has been used. Additionally, another note that is in the standard is that musculoskeletal disorders are covered under the disclosure of ill health. But in some countries, in some classifications, they can be considered injuries. And in those cases, the organizations can report musculoskeletal disorders as injuries and just explain why this is done.
We have also received a question on how organizations can assess water stress in an area. So maybe first good to explain is that the GRI standards define water stress as the ability, or lack thereof, to meet the human and ecological demand for water. And water stress can refer to the availability, the quality, or accessibility of water. Then when organizations are going to assess if there's water stress in an area, we do require organizations to use publicly available and credible tools and methodologies for assessing water stress. The guidance of the standard does include 2 publicly available and credible tools that organizations can use. And the first one is the Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas from the World Resources Institute. And the second is the Water Risk Filter from WWF. And then in addition to using these publicly available and credible tools and methodologies, an organization can also complement this information from these tools with own assessments to provide more information. Because sometimes it happens that a tool may say it's an area in water stress, and when you go really to a local level, you see it's not in really in water stress. So you can complement this information to help you assess areas with water stress. We've also received a question on rainwater, and if rainwater has to be included in the water withdrawal figure, and the answer is yes. And rainwater can be included as surface water there.
Hello, this is Andy. Just wanted to, on that question around water stress, I just wanted to flag that if listeners are looking for tools and resources to support the disclosure, that this is exactly the kind of thing that they'll find on the reporting exchange. So go to reportingexchange.com and have a look at what we have under there in terms of water stress tools.
Thank you very much, Andy. We received a general question about both of the standards and how to portray them in the content index, because in this case they have the same code as the old ones. And here what we want to stress is the importance of using the publication year to distinguish what kind of which standard you are using. So in the content index, for example, you would indicate GRI 403, 2016 or 2018, depending on which one you are using. This is because when the standards are reviewed or updated, for a certain period of time, we have the two versions of the same standard being valid. This is the transition period. So in this case, it is important for the clarity of the reader to tell them which of the two versions you are being used. And again, as I mentioned before, we encourage reporters to start using the 2018 version because this is the most up-to-date disclosures, and these go along with best practice on reporting and management. So even if organizations cannot report on the full set of disclosures, they can explain that, but it's better that we start transitioning and start using these new versions. Oh, and I see that we're just on top of the hour, so sadly we have no chance for more questions. But we had a quick question about sharing the presentation or the recording, and we are going to share it as soon as possible. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for the discussion. Goodbye, good day to you.